Dr. Mara Kensington, ER trauma surgeon, sprinting into a courthouse in bloodstained scrubs, arriving 30 minutes after her fiancé married her best friend, only to have a fraud detective reveal the wedding was funded by her own stolen savings. Here's the rewrite. I shoved through the heavy oak courthouse doors, still dressed in my faded green scrubs, with a surgical cap dangling loose from my ponytail. My sneakers squeaked violently against the polished tile, the sound bouncing off the walls like an alarm nobody could silence. My chest heaved with exhaustion, strands of hair plastered to my sweaty forehead, my fingers bearing faint traces of iodine from the operating table. I understood I was behind schedule, but I never imagined my whole future had already been ripped away. The security officer at the entrance shot me a glance dripping with sympathy before silently gesturing toward the far end of the hallway. When I shoved through the courtroom's inner doors, my breath caught violently in my throat at what I witnessed. Nathaniel, the man I planned to spend forever with, stood clutching the hands of Vivian, my closest friend since childhood. She was draped in an ivory gown, gripping the identical bouquet of blush roses I had personally selected for my own big day. The officiant had already snapped his binder shut, signaling the union was sealed. Nathaniel's mother, a sharp-tongued woman named Constance, marched straight toward me wearing a smug, victorious grin. She hissed that I'd arrived far too late and ordered me to remove myself from the premises. Just as humiliation propelled me toward the exit, an unfamiliar man planted himself in the doorway and altered everything that would happen next. To make sense of how I ended up frozen there in surgical scrubs, you should first understand my story. I'm Dr. Mara Kensington, an emergency trauma surgeon at a large metropolitan hospital. I sacrificed my 20s to textbooks and night rotations while my peers were out living carefree lives because saving people was never a job to me. It was a calling burned into my bones. That devotion consumed my entire existence, though it quietly wrecked every romance I ever attempted. It was 3 years back when I first crossed paths with Nathaniel Cole at a hospital fundraising gala, and I was convinced he was nothing like the men before him. He'd built a name for himself in luxury property development and never once flinched at my brutal hours or my paycheck. He'd proudly parade me in front of his business partners like I was his greatest achievement. Yet his mother, Constance, made her disapproval brutally clear at our very first family dinner, insisting I'd never fit the domestic mold she envisioned for her son. While Constance despised me openly, she practically worshipped my best friend, Vivian Marsh. Vivian and I had been tight since our freshman year of college, weathering breakups and triumphs together side by side. She was gorgeous, magnetic, and conveniently always available whenever my shifts stretched into the early morning hours. I overlooked every red flag. The lingering touches on Nathaniel's arm, the late-night texts he'd rush to hide. Nathaniel got down on one knee in our apartment kitchen on a frosty December night, and I said yes through happy tears. We settled on a small courthouse ceremony that October, just close family and a handful of dear friends. Vivian, as my maid of honor, helped me pick out my gown and organize every last detail. I was certain she was fiercely loyal to me, completely blind to the fact that she was scheming to claim the very life I was constructing for myself. Everything unraveled the morning of my wedding, when a 7-year-old boy named Eli was rushed into the ER with a burst appendix. His body was already spiraling into septic shock, and I knew any hesitation on my part would end his life. I phoned Nathaniel to explain the emergency, and he told me just to make it there by noon. I figured a 2-hour window would give me plenty of breathing room. Midway through the operation, Eli's vitals crashed without warning from an unexpected second rupture. My team scrambled to keep him alive, which dragged the surgery hours beyond what I'd planned. By the time I finally closed the incision, the clock read almost 1 p.m. I dialed Nathaniel's number over and over, but each call rolled straight to voicemail, so I bolted to my car in a blind panic. I drove recklessly through traffic and arrived at the courthouse at 2 o'clock sharp, convinced I still had time. Instead, I found my mother in tears in the hallway, explaining that Constance had manipulated the officiant into pushing the ceremony up by half an hour. Nathaniel and Vivian had already exchanged vows while I was fighting to keep a child alive on an operating table. My world cracked open right there, But before I could turn and disappear, a stranger stepped directly into my path. He introduced himself as Detective Marcus Wren from the White Collar Crimes Unit. His composure was eerily steady as he clutched a heavy folder stuffed with official paperwork. He told me he'd been attempting to reach me at the hospital for nearly a week regarding an active fraud case. Constance tried to intervene, screeching that I had no business being there anymore. But Detective Wren brushed her off entirely and asked me to step into the corridor with him. Once we were alone, he opened the folder and exposed the ugly financial truth behind Nathaniel. My new husband, it turned out, was drowning in a fraud judgment exceeding $200,000. Worse still, he'd quietly teamed up with Vivian to launch a covert company called Cole and Marsh Holdings. I stared at the incorporation papers in complete shock as my entire understanding of reality crumbled. Detective Wren revealed that Nathaniel had siphoned nearly $90,000 from our shared account directly into that secret venture. Suddenly, I recalled the stack of documents Nathaniel had rushed me to sign weeks earlier, insisting it was simple mortgage refinancing. I'd been running on no sleep after a brutal double shift and hadn't thought twice about trusting him. Every dollar I'd saved had been funneled into bankrolling their hidden affair and business scheme. The detective explained he was there that very day to formally serve both Nathaniel and Vivian with civil subpoenas. A surge of cold, steady resolve replaced my grief in an instant. I yanked my surgical cap off my head, stuffed it into my bag, and straightened my scrub top. I looked Detective Wren dead in the eye and asked to walk back into that courtroom to witness what was coming. We strode back inside together, and the room dropped into a suffocating total silence. Nathaniel spotted the badge clipped to Wren's belt, and every ounce of color drained from his face instantly. Vivian went rigid with fear as Detective Wren stepped forward and announced the fraud investigation for everyone to hear. He handed the first subpoena to Nathaniel, whose hands shook uncontrollably as his carefully built lies came crashing down around him. Then he extended the second document to Vivian, whose face flushed a deep, humiliated red. She let the subpoena and my bouquet of blush roses slip from her fingers onto the courtroom floor. Forced to crouch down in her wedding gown to gather them up, my own Aunt Renata broke the silence with a loud gasp of disbelief from the back row. I looked at the two people who had betrayed me and said quietly that I hoped it had all been worth it. Then I turned and walked out with my mother and my aunt trailing close behind. I hired a relentless attorney named Priscilla Hale, who moved quickly to strip my name from every compromised account. Within 48 hours, we had legal documentation proving I was an innocent victim of financial fraud. It took 8 grueling months of litigation, but I eventually clawed back $58,000 of what had been stolen from me. The fraudulent company Nathaniel and Vivian built together collapsed under a wave of investor lawsuits. The strain destroyed their marriage, and they filed for divorce just 7 months after their courthouse wedding. Constance actually reached out to me months later, insisting she'd had no idea about the stolen money. I told her that wasn't the thing she owed me an apology for, then hung up and never spoke to her again. Little Eli made a full recovery and was discharged from the hospital just 9 days after his surgery. His mother wrapped me in a hug and thanked me over and over for staying to finish what I'd started. Standing in that hospital hallway, I finally understood that saving him was exactly why I existed. The betrayal had stolen my naivety, but it never touched my purpose or my integrity. I found a peaceful apartment in a new part of the city and brought home a rescue dog for company. I stopped fearing that my demanding career made me unlovable or impossible to build a life with. On the most devastating morning of my life, my hands still did exactly what they were trained to do. A little boy got to keep growing up surrounded by his family. And I will choose that outcome over a counterfeit marriage every single